All right. Ever tried to picture sailing from New York to San Francisco, like way back before the Panama Canal?
Huh. Interesting thought.
Yeah, so get this. You'd have to go all the way around South America.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that'd be,
8,000 extra miles.
oh my goodness.
It's crazy. So today, we're diving deep into this whole story of the Panama Canal. It's ambition, crazy engineering, and honestly, a lot of controversy, too.
Yeah, and it's amazing how important this little piece of land, the Isthmus of Panama, has always been for trade. Like, even way before the canal, it was huge for the Spanish Empire. Think about it, all that gold and silver from Peru.
Having to get across to Spain somehow.
Exactly. Yeah.
And, it's really wild to think about those early ideas for a canal, like what the Spanish emperor was dreaming up in the 1500s.
Oh, yeah.
But it wasn't until the gold rush in California, right, in the mid-1800s, that things really started to take shape.
It's true.
Everyone wanted to get to the West Coast fast, and that's how the Panama Railroad was born.
It really changed the game. But I think people quickly realized a canal would be even more revolutionary. I mean, think about it. It could handle way more, stuff and people, opening up trade routes like never before.
And that's where the French come in, with Ferdinand de Lesseps, the guy behind the Suez Canal. I mean, it seemed like a guaranteed win,
Yeah.
but wow, were they in for a shock.
The French effort from 1881 to 1889, it was a complete disaster. I mean, they had these horrible challenges, especially those deadly mosquito diseases, malaria and yellow fever. An estimated 22,000 people died.
It's just heartbreaking, that number. It's difficult to even imagine that kind of loss and suffering.
It's tragic. And it wasn't just the human costs. They had financial mismanagement and political scandals that almost took down the French government. Shows you how complex these huge projects can be.
Absolutely. They also made a major engineering mistake, trying to build a sea-level canal,
Oh.
which meant digging up an insane amount of earth through the Continental Divide.
Well,
I mean, it was just impossible with the technology back then.
it makes you wonder, maybe their success with the Suez Canal made them overconfident?
Yeah.
Like they didn't understand the challenges of Panama's land and weather?
Right. And then, boom, Theodore Roosevelt walks in, ready to make the U.S. a global superpower. And the Panama Canal
Yeah.
seemed like the perfect chance to show off.
Roosevelt saw it as a chance to prove American ingenuity, show everyone we're the best. He wanted to finish what the French couldn't. And he wasn't afraid to use whatever he had to make it happen.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Panama was part of Colombia then,
Oh, yeah.
and Colombia. Not so happy with the U.S. offer for the canal zone.
They saw it as a threat to their control. They thought the U.S. was just trying to grab some of their land for themselves.
So what does the U.S. do? They encourage a group of Panamanians to revolt against Colombia.
Wow.
They even sent warships for support.
That's a bold move.
Extremely controversial. But the Panamanian revolt, with the U.S. backing them up, it worked quickly. And that's when things get even more ethically complicated.
Oh, how so?
Instead of making a treaty with the New Panama, the U.S. signs one with a Frenchman named Philippe Bonaventura. And get this, the guy hadn't been in Panama for 18 years.
You're kidding. 18 years.
It's crazy, right?
It really shows you how power was at play, right? I mean, this guy, Bonaventura, he had the rights to the French project, so he stood to gain a ton from the U.S. taking over.
Exactly. This treaty basically gave the U.S. total control over the canal zone, like forever. A giant chunk of land right through Panama.
Wow, what was the reaction like?
You can imagine, not exactly a party.
I bet.
There was outrage in Panama and in the U.S. Even the New York Times, which was usually pro-U.S., called it a national disgrace, a blatant act of imperialism. So this event really set the stage for decades of tension between the two countries. So now you've got this brand new republic, Panama. They owe their independence to the U.S., but at the same time, they've lost a huge part of their own control.
It's a complicated and ethically messy start for Panama. And this is all before they even started the huge job of actually building the canal. So, just try to imagine the scale of this thing. The U.S. had to build everything from scratch. Hospitals, housing, you name it, a whole infrastructure to support this massive project.
Like building a city in the jungle.
Pretty much. And they needed a workforce, to match the ambition of it all.
Yeah.
They brought in like these skilled engineers and workers from the US and Europe, of course. But the real backbone of the project, it was the tens of thousands of laborers they brought in from the Caribbean, mostly from Jamaica and Barbados.
And these workers, we're talking mainly Afro-Caribbean men,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
They faced, a completely different reality compared to the white workers.
Absolutely. You had the silver and gold system, one of the most blatant examples of racial discrimination you can find. The white workers, mostly Americans, they were paid in gold, better housing, paid vacations, good health care, the whole 9 yards.
And the Afro-Caribbean workers.
Silver wages, way lower pay, substandard housing, limited medical care, and they got stuck with the most dangerous jobs. It's just
Awful.
they were the ones, really on the front lines, doing the back-breaking work, the digging, the blasting, hauling, all that heavy stuff, constant threat of accidents, landslides, tropical diseases it was.
It's just a reminder of how bad, how deep racial prejudice was back then,
Yeah.
how it
Mhm.
shaped, everything, labor practices, social dynamics, everything.
Yeah, and the differences in treatment, the outcomes, it was just appalling. The U.S., they had a pretty low death rate among their workers because of sanitation and disease control advancements and all. But the Afro-Caribbean workers, they didn't have that. Many of them, they went back home with chronic illnesses, injuries, and their sacrifices, largely forgotten.
It's a tough part of the story. But despite all of this, the U.S. did manage to finish the canal in 1914, right as World War I was breaking out.
Yeah, it was a huge achievement for engineering and for human perseverance, honestly. But, the impact,
Yeah.
it wasn't quite what the U.S. had in
They
mind.
thought it would be this, revolution for domestic trade, right? Put the U.S. at the top of the global economy.
That was the hope. And while it did change global shipping routes, yeah, made travel time shorter, connected markets that were far apart, the impact on the U.S. itself, it wasn't as big as they thought it would be. I mean, the U.S. railroad system was already pretty strong, and the huge jump in trade between the East and West Coasts, it didn't really happen.
But it did have major consequences on the world stage, right? Like shifting power and giving the U.S. more influence in Latin America and the Pacific.
For sure. It made the U.S. a dominant force in that region, no question.
Mhm.
But it also led to more resentment, more anti-American sentiment, especially in Panama. Remember those tensions we talked about?
Uh-huh.
They were still simmering under the surface. Panama felt like they were being occupied, the U.S. controlling this vital waterway that cut right through their country. And then in 1964, riots broke out, a sign of the growing unrest and the Panamanians demanding control, demanding their sovereignty.
And by this point, the world is changing too. Decolonization movements everywhere, right?
Right.
Challenging the old colonial powers, demanding independence.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S., they had to realize they couldn't hold on to the canal forever.
Exactly. So after years of back and forth negotiations, all that, the U.S. and Panama, they signed the Torrijos-Carter treaties in 1977.
A big moment in history.
Huge. It set the stage for the canal to be, well, given back to Panama. And it all culminated on December 31st, 1999, when they got full control.
Wow, what a day. The end of a century of U.S. control. The start of something new for Panama.
Absolutely. But, of course, not everyone was happy about it. Some people in the U.S., especially figures like Ronald Reagan, they argued that the U.S. was giving away a vital asset, a symbol of American power.
It's interesting how that idea, the U.S. giving away the canal, it's still around today.
Yeah.
Shows you how some people see history, right? They overlook colonialism and the legitimate desire of countries to be independent, to decide their own fate.
Right, and it's important to remember that the canal, it was built on Panamanian land. The people of Panama had always wanted control of this waterway. It was a huge part of their destiny as a nation.
So on that day in 1999, Panama took charge. What happened next might surprise some people.
You think so?
I do.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the big picture stuff, geopolitics, engineering, all that. But the individual stories, those are what make the history of the Panama Canal, really come alive.
Absolutely. And there's so many to explore. Like, think about the West Indian workers who came to Panama, looking for a chance, only to find these awful conditions and discrimination.
Yeah, it's tough to imagine leaving your home, your family, traveling thousands of miles to a completely new place, just hoping for a better life.
And then facing that reality,
Yeah, a lot of them came for the promise of higher wages, a way to escape poverty, lack of opportunities back home. But what they found, often a lot different.
Yeah, we talked about the silver and gold system, the inequality, but there was so much more, like cultural clashes, language barriers, that feeling of being isolated far from their communities, their support systems.
It really shows the human cost of these huge, ambitious projects. And their contributions were essential to the canal's success. But their stories, they don't often get told.
It's important to bring those stories to light, though, to remember the sacrifices that were made, the impact on the lives of the people who built this thing.
Absolutely. And then there's the impact on the environment, too. the indigenous communities who lived in this region long before the canal.
That's something we haven't really touched on yet. It's easy to forget about the environment when you're focused on the engineering achievements.
Definitely. Building the canal meant clearing huge areas of rainforest, disrupting ecosystems, displacing indigenous people, creating Gatun Lake. Yeah, it's an amazing feat of engineering, but it also meant villages and ancestral lands got submerged.
Progress, but at a cost.
Yeah. And often the people who pay the highest price are the ones with the least power, the least say in what happens.
That's a powerful reminder. So, as we think about the legacy of the Panama Canal, we got to consider all these different sides, the triumphs, the tragedies, the consequences, both the intended and the unintended ones.
Yeah, it's a symbol of human ingenuity, no question. But it also reminds us that we need to understand the full context of historical events, the social aspects, the environmental, the ethical dimensions, everything.
It's a story that still matters today.
Yeah.
It makes us ask tough questions about how we do these big projects, how we balance economic development and protecting the environment, how we make sure the benefits of progress are shared fairly.
Big questions, important ones. How can we learn from what happened with the Panama Canal? How can we use those lessons for the challenges we're facing now? Building sustainable infrastructure, tackling climate change, creating more just societies.
Definitely things to think about, especially as the world becomes more interconnected. Our decisions have consequences that'll be felt for generations.
That's for sure. The Panama Canal, it shows us that history isn't just about the past, it's about now, and it's about the future, too. It's full of insights, warnings, and also inspiring examples of how humans can adapt and be resilient.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Panama Canal, here's something to think about. How can we learn from the past to create a future that's more sustainable, more equitable, more interconnected?
Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep learning. Understanding history isn't just about remembering, it's about shaping what's to come.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Panama Canal. We'll be back next time with another fascinating exploration of the past, present, and future.